They unearthed her remains in 2019, buried beneath the collapsed timber hall outside Wareham, and the first thing the excavation team noticed was the unnatural position of her arms, drawn tight behind her ribs as though bound long after death, while the cracked vertebrae at her neck suggested a violent twisting that froze her final attempt to resist. And as the researchers brushed away the soil, they found the iron ring still attached to her ankle. Its chain was broken at the midpoint, as if she had dragged herself across the floor, trying to escape the men who had dragged her there. The men whose footprints were preserved in the hardened mud layered around her, overlapping each other like a record of chaos that had never been meant to survive. The charred roof beams above her encased the smell of burned thatch, and the soil around her skull held faint beads of amber that once belonged to a royal necklace torn from her throat during the struggle. This is what the chroniclers of Wessex tried to hide until now. In the summer of AD 876, when the Kingdom of Wessex was already gasping beneath the weight of repeated Viking invasions, Queen Elswith of Mercia, then acting as consort and envoy for delicate negotiations, traveled with a small retinue toward the fortified estate at Sinwit, believing she would meet envoys from Guthrum under the promise of a temporary truce. And the chronicles tell us that she carried with her not only diplomatic seals, but also personal letters intended for families displaced by the raids. The journey was quiet enough that the sound of hooves on the damp earth blended with the distant calls of shepherds, giving her the illusion of stability that had not existed since the first longships carved their way into southern England. And that momentary calm, so described in the later Wessex annals, was the first miscalculation that set the tragedy in motion. The Vikings had already learned her route through intercepted messages and men who served under the war leader. Whole Iron Skull had shadowed her convoy for nearly half a day before springing the ambush in a narrow wooded pass where the canopy above swallowed most of the afternoon light, giving the attackers a natural shroud beneath which they could move with unsettling coordination. Ealhswith's guards outnumbered and unprepared for the silent arrows that cut through the humid air fell in rapid succession while the Queen's horse reared violently, forcing her to cling to the saddle as she tried to make sense of the chaos erupting around her. The chroniclers later argued about whether the invaders wanted ransom or leverage, but a recovered fragment of a letter found decades later in the ruins of Chippenham makes it clear that the Vikings saw noble women not merely as political assets, but as living symbols of submission, trophies through which entire kingdoms could be humiliated. And it was this belief that sealed her fate long before she realized she had been marked. When the surviving guards were dragged into the underbrush and the Queen's hands were bound with coarse rope that burned through her skin, the last of her attendants recorded seeing Hull himself grip her veil and pull it away with a deliberate calm that terrified even the men around him because it showed he had no intention of negotiation. What happened next was documented by Brother Aldred of Glastonbury, and it sat hidden for centuries. When Brother Aldred's manuscript was finally removed from the wormy tin chest beneath Glastonbury's southern cloister in 1714, long after ash and moisture had erased most of the monastic record from the 9th century. The archivists who handled it noticed the way his handwriting shifted from steady ecclesiastical formality into jagged, uneven strokes as if his hand trembled uncontrollably during the final pages, and they remarked upon the faint circular stains across the parchment, mint, which suggested sweat rather than deliberate ink, because only someone writing under immense fear would leave evidence of their own trembling preserved between lines of Latin scripture. The camp did not resemble the neat wooden palisades often depicted in later manuscripts, but instead sprawled chaotically across the hillside with animal hides stretched between stakes, fire pits dug shallow into the chalky soil, and a central timber hall erected so quickly that bark still clung to the beams, giving the entire structure the appearance of something ripped raw from the forest. Aldred notes the stench immediately, describing how smoke, wet wool, blood, and fermenting ale formed a heavy cloud that hovered close to the ground and settled on everything. making it difficult to distinguish the odors of cooking from those of decay. And this inability to separate the mundane from the horrific sets the tone for the remainder of his writing. He claims that Ealhswith was brought into the camp at dusk, her hair torn loose from its bindings, and her gown stiffened with mud and ash. And he writes that the Vikings did not shout or jeer when they saw her, but instead became silent in a way that unnerved both captives and warriors alike, because the silence carried an expectation, the sense that something ritualized was about to unfold, making it difficult to distinguish the odors of cooking from those of decay. And this inability to separate the mundane from the horrific sets the tone for the remainder of his writing. He claims that Ealhswith was brought into the camp at dusk, her hair torn loose from its bindings, and her gown stiffened with mud and ash. And he writes that the Vikings did not shout or jeer when they saw her, but instead became silent in a way that unnerved both captives and warriors alike, because the silence carried an expectation, the sense that something ritualized was about to unfold. The monk describes her as limping, her left ankles swollen from the ropes, and he records the eerie detail that one of the warriors placed a carved wooden disc, etched with the symbol of Mor Tuther, the fate maker, beside her on the ground, as though marking her not simply as a prisoner, but as an offering. And Aldred confesses that he did not understand its meaning until much later. But that was not the worst part. Next, he writes of the hall itself, a rough timber structure coated in soot from the many fires that burned just inside the entrance. And he notes that the interior was arranged in a manner unlike the mead halls described by the Anglo-Saxon poets, because instead of benches lining the edges, the Vikings had cleared the center to create a wide circular space upon which they layered straw, ash, and what Aldred recognized as fragments of broken spear shafts that had been sharpened along one edge. This arrangement struck him as ceremonial rather than practical, and he repeatedly refers to the circle as the Ring of Humiliation, a term that appears in no other surviving record, but which modern historians believe refers to an important Norse practice known as Nyanjurhenger, a ritual circle used to strip honor from captured nobility. The presence of such a circle raises disturbing implications about how the Vikings viewed their highest-ranking captives. Because this was not a space created for ransom negotiations or interrogation, but a space constructed specifically to break a person's status before witnesses. Aldred's most chilling passage describes the moment. Ealhswith was forced to kneel at the circle's edge, surrounded by warriors who tapped their spear shafts on the ground in a slow, rhythmic cadence that reverberated through the hall like a heartbeat. He notes that the queen did not cry out, though her breathing became uneven. And he records that when the war leader Hall stepped forward, he held not a weapon but a small iron hook attached to a leather cord, a tool Aldred recognized from descriptions of earlier raids as the heron. The raven tooth, a device used to mark captives who were not expected to be returned. What unsettles the reader is the way Aldred describes Hawk's expression, because he insists that the leader did not look enraged or eager for violence, but calm, almost contemplative, as if carrying out a duty whose significance transcended the individuals before him. And this calmness creates a horrifying contrast with what occurs next. The monk admits that he looked away when Hall lowered the raven tooth toward the queen's collarbone, but he writes that he could not block out the sound. A muffled gasp followed by the scraping of metal against flesh. And he notes that one of the younger warriors flinched visibly, suggesting that even within the Viking ranks, there were men who questioned the practice. Aldred forces himself to describe the aftermath, explaining that a thin line of blood traced down Ealhswith's shoulder and dripped into the straw, where it mixed with ash to create a dark, muddy paste that clung to her gown. And he remarks that this image haunted him for years because it represented the moment she shifted, in their eyes, from queen to captive, from sovereign to spoil. But again, he warns the reader that this was not the worst part. Later in the manuscript, Aldred includes a direct quotation that he attributes to Hawk, written in Old Norse but translated by later archivists. "A queen is worth nothing unless her kingdom bleeds through her. The line reveals a brutal logic that underpinned the Viking strategy, a belief that conquering a ruler's body signified the conquering of their people. And while Aldred does not elaborate in explicit detail, he implies that the queen's treatment was intended as both political theater and psychological warfare. His decision to record these words word for word, as he states, indicates that he understood their significance, because no chronicler of Wessex would have dared attribute such intentions to their enemies in an official document. Yet Aldred writes them with a rawness that suggests he wanted later generations to confront the truth rather than the sanitized narratives preserved in royal annals. The manuscript then shifts into a description of the other captives held at Ham Hill, including a young noblewoman named Wulfwine, recorded as being only 17, who had been seized during the earlier raid on Wareham and who, according to Aldred, was kept in a small pit dug into the chalk covered by an animal hide weighted with stones. He writes that she whispered constantly in the darkness, repeating fragments of prayers she barely remembered, and he notes that her fingernails were broken and packed with soil from trying to claw her way upward, a detail that reveals the desperation that permeated the camp. Aldred describes how Wulfwine was dragged into the hall one evening, her hair matted, her voice reduced to a rasp, and how she collapsed upon seeing Aldred standing within the ritual circle because the two had known each other through the royal households, and the sight of her queen, marked in such a way, shattered whatever strength she had retained. Yet Aldred writes that Wulfwine's despair became a catalyst for what unfolded next. He claims that Hull intended to perform a second marking ritual upon Wulfwine, but when one of the older warriors hesitated and muttered that the gods had accepted enough for this season, Hull struck him across the jaw with the butt of his spear and ordered the ritual to proceed, demonstrating the severity with which dissent was punished. This moment, Aldred writes, convinced him that the practices enacted in the hall were not universally supported within the SC ranks, and he records that he later saw the same warrior sitting alone near the edge of camp, clutching his jaw and damped, and staring into the distance with a troubled expression. The presence of dissent makes the manuscript even more unsettling because it reveals that the horror was not born solely from cultural norms, but from the choices of specific men who enforced their own interpretation of ritual authority with ruthless precision. But Aldred warns again, this too was not the worst part. As the manuscript nears its end, Aldred's writing becomes increasingly fragmented, his sentences elongating into frantic tangles of description and prayer, as though he were running out of time or sanity. He describes one final scene in the hall, lit by torches whose smoke gathered thickly along the rafters, creating the illusion that the ceiling writhed like a living thing. Ealhswith stands in the center, her hands bound before her, her posture stiff yet defiant, and Aldred notes that her gaze remained steady even as Hull approached. With a second raven tooth, this one larger its tip, forged into a cruel hook. The monk insists that he cannot describe what happened next without violating the sanctity of his vows. Yet he hints at it through metaphor, writing that the queen's shadow broke upon the floor like a vessel shattered, a line that continues to baffle historians but conveys a sense of irrevocable harm. Aldred ends his account with a single sentence written in a hand so unsteady that later archivists debated whether it had been written by the same person. God does not dwell in that hall, and neither shall I again. The final folio contains no further narrative, only a partially erased prayer and a smear of dark residue that some researchers believe to be dried blood, though no formal analysis has ever confirmed it. Brother Aldred never wrote again. The center of the Viking hall at Ham Hill, as Brother Aldred's fragmented manuscript suggests and as modern archaeological reconstructions confirm, was not merely a gathering space, but an engineered theater of domination where the boundaries between ritual, humiliation, and political warfare dissolved into one unbroken performance of power. And to understand what actually happened within that circle, one must understand the Viking belief that conquering a queen held the same symbolic weight as breaching the walls of a stronghold. For royalty and Saxon ideology embodied lineage, sanctity, and divine appointment, whereas in Norse cosmology, The capture of such a figure represented a triumph of fate over order, a demonstration that the Norns favored the raider more than the ruler. It is this intersection of symbolic conquest and political coercion that formed the backbone of what historians have come to call the ritual of breaking, a term reconstructed from fragments of Old Norse inscriptions and Anglo-Saxon laments, which described not a single act of violence, but a sequence of controlled degradations intended to sever a captive queen from her previous identity while transmitting a message of helplessness to the kingdom from which she came. The first stage of this ritual involved the stripping away of objects tied to her rank and archaeological evidence from Ham Hill, especially the discovery of a crushed gilded brooch and the shattered remains of a ceremonial girdle. Indicates that Elwith's symbols of royal legitimacy were not simply confiscated, but intentionally destroyed, broken beneath the hafts of spear shafts in the presence of the warriors who had ambushed her escort. Because this symbolic destruction was meant to demonstrate that her lineage no longer shielded her. Aldred's manuscript underlines this moment with a trembling line in which he writes that the men did not look upon her as a woman or as a queen, but as a gateway, a statement whose ambiguous meaning has fueled centuries of debate. Yet all interpretations agree that it foreshadows the deeper purpose of the ritual. But that was only the beginning. The second stage, reconstructed through Aldred's writing and skeletal evidence found in similar Viking encampments across East Anglia, involved forced procession around the ritual circle, where the queen, ankles bound by a rope looped through a carved wooden ring, was compelled to walk the perimeter while warriors recited oaths of dominance tied to their clan ancestry. This procession served not as entertainment, but as a legal reenactment, reflecting older Scandinavian traditions in which captives were paraded to signify contested ownership. But in the case of high-born women such as Alswith, the procession carried a more sinister undertone. For by forcing her to walk in the ring of humiliation, the Vikings believed they were symbolically unmaking her marriage bonds, dissolving the alliances she embodied, and severing her from the sacred oath she had once carried for the Mercian throne. Aldred writes that she stumbled once, then twice, and that each time a warrior tightened the rope until the skin around her ankle bruised so deeply it appeared almost black beneath the torchlight. Yet she refused to cry out, and the silence she maintained angered Hull, who believed that resistance, even in the form of mute dignity, diminished the potency of the ritual itself. The third stage of this system involved the recitation of the king's mail or speech of dishonor, in which the war leader delivered a set of accusations, many of them invented, against the captive queen, denouncing her as a breaker of oaths, betrayer of gods, and corrupter of lineage. Because in the Viking worldview, stripping someone of reputation inflicted a wound as deep as physical mutilation. And once those words were spoken, the captive's identity became vulnerable to redefinition. Aldred records that Hal stood before Alswith and thundered accusations in Old Norse, while warriors struck their spear shafts against the ground in deliberate cadence. And although she likely understood few of the words, the ceremony was constructed so that understanding was irrelevant. The purpose was transformation, not communication. But Aldred's manuscript reveals something more unsettling. He writes that at the height of the ritual, the warriors suddenly parted to reveal a second captive, a young noblewoman named Senrith, daughter of a miner, Ealdorman from Dorset, who had been dragged from her hiding place during the earlier raids and was now forced to kneel at Elwith's side. Her face was hollow with exhaustion, and her wrists were rubbed raw from cords that had cut deeply into her skin. Senrith's presence signaled the next stage of the ritual. And Aldred's description of what followed is among the most haunting lines in the entire manuscript. He writes that the Vikings believed the breaking of queens was incomplete unless witnessed by another noblewoman of high blood, because the ritual demanded a reflection, a second life diminished by the first life's collapse, so that the humiliation would echo back into the communities from which they came. To achieve this, Senrith was forced to mirror Ealhwith's posture, her knees pressed into the straw-strewn floor, her head bowed. And Aldred notes that Hall touched the raven tooth to both women's shoulders in a slow, deliberate pattern, marking them not as individuals, but but as symbols of conquered England. The raven tooth, recovered in fragments during excavations in 2003, shows wear consistent with repeated ritual contact, and its discovery confirms that Aldred's account, while emotionally charged, reflected physical realities present in the archaeological record. But the ritual did not end with marking. At this point, Aldred's writing grows increasingly strained. His pen strokes were jagged, the ink pooling unevenly, as though he were forcing himself to record something abhorrent, yet historically necessary. He describes how the warriors encircled the two noble women and began chanting genealogies of their clans, blending names of both ancestors and mythic figures, invoking the Norns, and demanding that fate ratify the domination enacted in the hall. The chant, according to Aldred, was hypnotic and relentless, and punctuated by guttural exclamations that reverberated through the hall like fragments of thunder trapped within wooden walls. And he writes that the torchlight above seemed to warp and stretch, distorting the faces of the warriors into grotesque masks of shadow and flame. Elswith, he notes, did not bow her head even once, though Senfith trembled uncontrollably, whispering fragments of prayers that dissolved into the roar of the chants. The ritual's next stage, though Aldred refuses to describe it in explicit language, is suggested through metaphor in his next line. The circle devoured their rank, their bonds, and their lineage, and returned them into darkness unrecognizable. Modern scholars interpret this line as evidence of forced ritual subjugation, a symbolic unmaking of queenship enacted through layers of humiliation designed to strip agency, identity, and social order. But Aldred's next sentences reveal the most disturbing implication. He writes that Hal declared before the assembly that England would not only lose its queen, but that her bloodline would bend beneath the will of the North, a statement that scholars interpret as a reference to forced integration into Norse households where captured noble women were often compelled implicitly through coercion and captivity to accept new roles that placed them far beneath the stations they once held. Aldred's refusal to detail this transformation directly is telling, for monks often described wars, executions, and torments with considerable detail. Yet here, he resorts to allegory, indicating both personal revulsion and the enormity of what occurred in the hall. The dissenting voice in this ritual, mentioned briefly in Section 2, emerges again in Aldred's manuscript. At this moment, he writes that one of Hawk's warriors, a man named Orm, stepped forward and muttered that the gods have seen too much tonight. And though his voice was quiet, several warriors paused, glancing at Hawk as though expecting reprisal. Hawk approached Orm slowly, his face unreadable, and Aldred records that the entire hall fell silent as the leader touched the raven tooth to Orm's beard and whispered something inaudible. Moments later, Orm was dragged to the edge of the camp by two younger warriors, and Aldred writes that he heard a single sharp cry, followed by the sound of something heavy collapsing into the bracken. Orm's body was never recovered, but a shallow grave found in 1998 near the eastern slope of Ham Hill contained a skeleton with a crushed jaw consistent with a spearbutt strike and a deep cleft in the skull leading archaeologists who believe the grave belonged to a dissenting Viking warrior, executed by his own commander. This discovery confirms what Aldred hints at, that dissent existed, but the cost of dissent was annihilation. The final stage of the ritual, reconstructed through Aldred's last coherent lines, involved the symbolic surrender of the queen to fate, enacted by binding her wrists with strips of woven wool dyed in the colors of her own kingdom. A cruel inversion of marriage rites used in Saxon ceremonies, signifying not union, but dispossession. Aldred notes that the wool bands were pulled tight enough to cut into her skin. And he writes that the blood staining the threads created a twisted parody of the consecrated bindings used in Christian betrothals. Senrith too was bound, though her restraints were heavier, suggesting she had resisted more fiercely, and Aldred writes that when she collapsed forward, her tears mingled with the ash on the floor, forming dark streaks across her face that gave her the appearance of a child smeared by soot. At this point, the manuscript fractures, interrupted by smudges, blotches, and abrupt shifts in tone. As if Aldred could not bring himself to describe the final humiliation enacted upon the two women. Yet, he leaves enough fragments to indicate that their identities as sovereign and noble were symbolically annihilated before they were removed from the hall. The fate of Ilial-Shwith after the ritual remains partially obscured by gaps in Aldred's writing, but he notes that she was dragged into the night and taken toward the northern encampment where political prisoners were kept, suggesting she was intended as leverage for future negotiations, though her condition after the ritual would have made any such leverage fraught with cruelty. Seneth's fate is clear. Ared writes that she was taken by a group of warriors toward a lower enclosure used for distributing captives. Among raiders and skeletal remains found in 2019 bearing binding marks and a distinctive hairpin known to have belonged to her family strongly suggest she did not survive long after her removal from the hall. These fates illustrate not exceptional cases, but common outcomes. For across the 9th century campaigns, chroniclers estimate that more than 60 high-born Saxon women were captured and subjected to similar cycles of humiliation and captivity. Though few accounts survived because families suppressed the details to preserve lineage, honor, and prevent political rupture. Aldred's account concludes with a final haunting line before his writing dissolves entirely into chaotic markings. They broke the queen. But in breaking her, they broke something in us all. The line reveals a monk who understood the ritual not only as a personal tragedy, but also as a symbolic wound inflicted upon the cultural identity of an entire kingdom. A wound preserved in silence by those who survived it, and erased deliberately by those who wanted to forget. But the silence would not last forever. When historians attempt to quantify the scale of what unfolded across Wessex and Mercia during the 9th century Viking campaigns, they often rely on royal annals, monastic correspondence, and reconstructed genealogical tables. Yet these sources, fragmented, politically curated, and steeped in the rhetoric of sanctified resistance, never state openly the number of noble women who vanished between the years 865 and 891, forcing researchers to turn instead to indirect indicators: sudden breaks in aristocratic family lines, unexplained guardianships transferred to monasteries, dowry records abruptly ending mid-generation, and burial sites that contain royal grave goods paired with skeletal trauma inconsistent with domestic life. When these strands are woven together, a grim picture emerges, suggesting that more than 60 Saxon and noble women, including at least 4 recorded queens or queen consorts, were seized, transported, and subjected to ritual humiliation or coerced captivity. Their lives were erased not through fire or blade alone, but through the systematic unmaking of identity that the Vikings employed as an extension of warfare. The number grows more haunting when one considers the unrecorded daughters of minor lords, foster children of courtly households, and novices of aristocratic lineage taken from monasteries. For those names never entered the annals at all and survive only as the faintest shadows across property records that suddenly cease without explanation. The survivors of these rituals, though few in number, carried the aftermath upon their bodies and minds in ways that shaped entire communities. And it is in monastic petitions for land grants, legal pleas submitted by displaced families, and obscure penitentiary texts that one glimpses the long-term impact of captivity and humiliation upon those who returned. Some women, such as a noblewoman later identified as Ethelber of Sherborne, were found wandering near trade routes months after their abduction, unable or unwilling to speak of what had occurred. Their hair was hacked unevenly in the manner used by Vikings to mark captives who had been claimed, and their wrists were scarred by restraints so deeply etched that even decades later they bore the physical geometry of their suffering. Others were returned during brief truces, but lived the remainder of their lives in monastic enclosures, refusing marriage, refusing court, and refusing even to be recorded by name, as though the act of naming might force them to re-enter a world that had once been stripped from them with brutal efficiency. Chroniclers note that several took vows without undergoing formal training, entering religious life not out of devotion, but out of a desperate desire to sever themselves from all earthly bonds. And these unspoken stories ripple quietly through the margins of ecclesiastical texts, forming a silent, parallel archive of trauma. The reason these accounts faded from official history lies not in accident, but in deliberate erasure. For the political machinery of Wessex could not afford to memorialize the humiliation of its queens and noblewomen without undermining its claims of divine sanction, stability, and moral authority, especially as the kingdom sought to present itself as the bulwark against pagan invasion. Royal scribes strategically omitted incidents that cast doubt upon the inviolability of the royal household, and church authorities eager to maintain the sanctity of queenship as an institution blessed by God suppressed narratives that suggested the physical vulnerability of women whose legitimacy was tied to sacred ritual. Families concealed the fates of their daughters to protect marriage alliances, avoiding any record that might taint lineage or disrupt the delicate balance of power among rival houses. Over generations, this silence calcified into official memory, leaving only sanitized versions of events shaped by political necessity rather than truth. But despite this imposed forgetting, the land remembered what the scribes tried to erase. In 2003, excavations at Ham Hill uncovered a shallow pit containing the remains of a young woman whose skeletal structure displayed signs of prolonged binding at the wrists and ankles, along with a distinctive hairpin carved with the sigil of a Dorset noble family, confirming what Aldred hinted at in his manuscript. Then, in 2019, the discovery outside Wareham of a collapsed hall containing a female skeleton bound at the arms and accompanied by fragments of a gilded brooch belonging to the royal Mercian line provided undeniable evidence that the ritual described in Aldred's writings was not metaphorical but physically enacted upon real bodies. The archaeologists who uncovered her remains described the experience as profoundly disquieting, for the positioning of her bones suggested violent restraint prior to death, while the soil composition surrounding the torso contained traces of ash and crushed straw consistent with the ritual circle Aldred documented. Dr. Alfreda Good, the lead archaeologist at the Wareham site, stated in her initial summary that the posture of the body indicates subjugation rather than burial, a phrasing that sparked immediate debate, but which she defended by pointing to the tacked iron ankle ring found near the remains, a detail too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Yet the most haunting evidence emerged not from skeletal trauma or broken artifacts, but from a small piece of carved bone, recovered near the threshold of the hall during the same excavation. The bone fragment, believed to be part of a decorative comb or ceremonial object, bore a line of crudely scratched runes that, once deciphered, revealed a message almost certainly inscribed by one of the captives or by someone who witnessed their suffering. The message, written in a mixture of Old English and adapted Norse characters, reads Umbrian Shizis, which translates to, "They took our royal line and shattered our strength." The inscription is remarkable, not only for its emotional resonance, but also for the fact that someone risked their life to carve it, leaving behind a message intended not for contemporaries who could not intervene, but for future generations who might one day uncover the truth, concealed beneath centuries of silence. This final message stands as the clearest testament to what the rituals of capture and humiliation truly meant, not only for Senrith and the many unnamed women who vanished into Viking encampments, but for the collective psyche of a people whose sense of stability and lineage was systematically fractured. It reminds us that beneath the layers of political propaganda, heroic epics, and sanitized chronicles lie the voices of those whom history attempted to erase. Voices that persist in bone, ash, soil, and scratched lines of desperate testimony. And as long as these traces remain, the truth cannot be wholly silenced, no matter how fervently those in power attempt to bury it. When we return to the collapsed hall outside Wareham, the same hall where the archaeologists found the bound skeleton with the shattered vertebrae and the broken royal necklace pressed into the soil beside her ribs, we begin to understand that the story Aldred recorded was not a fevered monastic nightmare, but a fragment of a larger truth that stretched across decades of invasion, negotiation, betrayal, and ritual humiliation. A truth that kingdoms suppressed because acknowledging it would mean admitting the fragility of their sanctity and the vulnerability of the women whose bodies bore the consequences of war. The queen buried beneath those charred beams did not die alone. She died as part of a system that treated noble women as symbols to be broken, warnings to be sent, and foundations to be destabilized. And in her fate, we see reflected the fates of Senrith, Wulfwyn, Ethelborough, and the many unnamed daughters of lords and reeves, whose stories were whispered only in private chambers before being erased entirely from public memory. This is what the chroniclers of Wessex tried to hide. For to reveal the depth of the ritual enacted at Ham Hill would have meant acknowledging that the kingdom's royal household, steeped in layers of divine legitimacy and political performance, could be pierced at its core and reshaped by invaders who understood that conquering land was far less effective than conquering lineage. And when an empire or a kingdom decides that some people are not people, but instruments through which messages of fear can be carved, the human cost becomes immeasurable, stretching beyond the bones found in shallow pits or the inscriptions etched into fragments of horn, to the very identity of the culture that allowed those erasures to endure. Yet the victims themselves refused total silence for the bone fragment carved with a desperate message. Haynamoon, the uric acid on the brain of the cheetah, finishes. They took our royal line and shattered our strength. Survived not because history wished to remember it, but because someone risked everything to leave behind a final trace of truth. That message echoes across the centuries, quiet yet unbroken, a testament to lives that were meant to vanish without record.